Let me begin by wishing everybody a good Yom Tov. Hey Tevis, the 5th day of the Hebrew month of Tevis, is a Yom Tov, a day of celebration. It celebrates the victory in federal court of the trial where the library amassed by the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe was returned to its rightful place as the common property of Chabad as a movement. And it symbolizes the much more than just the return of the property, but the affirmation of the ongoing, living activity of Chabad. So, having said that, I guess let me just explain. Everything has guf v'neshama, a body and a soul. Or maybe you could call it the outer trappings and the inner spiritual meaning. Like, for instance, on Rosh Hashanah, the mitzvah is you blow the shofar, but the inner meaning is the coronation of God as king, right? So the inner meaning of Hey Tevis is really about the continued leadership of the Rebbe and the Rebbe's continued relationship with Chassidim, and that's not interrupted by physical passing, and as the Rebbe said many times during that period, Mazare b'chaim afhu b'chaim, quoting the Talmudic dictum that refers to Yankov Avinu, just as his descendants are alive, so he is alive. That as long as people are studying Chassidus and living according to Chassidus, so the Rebbe is alive. So that's the inner meaning of Hey Tevis. But the outer expression of that, if you want to put it to a tangible action, it is the purchase of, repair of, and study of holy books. So it is very providential, hashgacha pratis, that tonight's class, which is a monthly series, which we have been doing this year on the Mitzvah Campaigns, the Mivtzaim, that tonight, and I don't think this was planned this way, but we're doing the Mivtza Bais Malei Sefarim, the Rebbe's campaign to amass books, to have a home full of holy books, that this coincides with Hey Tevis, which really there's no more appropriate day on the Jewish calendar to be speaking about amassing books. So let's jump in. Let me talk a little bit first of all about Hey Tevis in connection with books. The actual incident of the verdict happened Tafshin Mem Zayin, 1987. And there was a great celebration, unbridled celebration, legendary celebration for a week. But it wasn't so clear that it was going to become an annual observance. And for those who know a little bit of the what we call inside baseball, there was an event that occurred about a month before the first anniversary where they were actually bringing the books of Svadim, the actual containers with the holy books in them, were being brought back to 770. And yeshiva students came out and were dancing, and the Rebbe voiced clear disapproval of that activity. Why are you dancing when we're bringing the books back? Go study the books. Don't dance, study. So because of that, it wasn't clear if the Rebbe was happy with Hey Tevis being celebrated every year. But then, on the first anniversary, meaning a month after that incident of Beis Kislev, on the first anniversary of Hey Tevis, meaning Tavshin Mem Ches, the Rebbe made it very clear that yes, this is an event to be celebrated each and every year on the date. And that's when the Rebbe said the way to celebrate it, again, we're speaking about there's the inner and the outer, right? The deeper meaning of Hey Tevis is infinitely deep. But the outer expression of it, the tangible expression, the Rebbe said has to do with books. Why? I mean, the connection is obvious that the whole Hey Tevis came about because of contested property that were books, okay? Obviously, the whole the story of Hey Tevis touches much deeper than just these books. As I was saying, it has to do with the whole notion of the enduring relationship of a Rebbe with Chassidim. But as point of fact, the contested property and that which precipitated an actual legal battle were books. So therefore, the way to celebrate and commemorate Hey Tevis is also with books. And so that year, the first anniversary of Hey Tevis, 5748, 1988, the Rebbe said that it should be celebrated in conjunction with purchasing books. And then the Rebbe mentioned, actually, that year, 1988, or Tavshin Mem Ches, was the 500th birthday of Rav Yosef Karo, the Mechaber, the author of the Shulchan Aruch. So the Rebbe said that there should be sales discounting the price of Shulchan Aruch so that people will study the works of Yosef Karo. Now, on the second anniversary of Hey Tevis, Tavshin Mem Tes, talking about now 1989, the Rebbe reiterated that the outer expression of the day should be connected with books. Buying books, repairing books, the Rebbe mentioned returning books. You know, books are one of those things you never, you got to be careful to lend them out because for some reason people never give them back. You know, you lend somebody, I don't know, your lawnmower, they'll bring it back. You give them Svadim, for some reason they don't come back with it. Anyways, so if you have books that need to be returned, go return those books. And then the Rebbe gave out dollars that day, and interestingly, the Rebbe gave everybody $2. Now the Rebbe always would give $1 for tzedakah. That was the whole idea of the dollars, is to make you a shliach mitzvah to go give tzedakah. Not with that precise dollar, because it was understood that people would want to hold on to it as a keepsake, but the equivalent of the dollar. The Rebbe was making you, deputizing you to be a shliach mitzvah to go to give $1. But then, Tavshin Mem Tes, the Rebbe gave out $2 and said that the second dollar, first dollar was tzedakah, as per usual, but the second dollar was for buying Svadim because it's Hey Tevis, and Hey Tevis is about buying Svadim. And Kahos, which is the publishing arm of Lubavitch, they have a bookstore across the street, across the parkway from 770. It got absolutely swarmed with throngs of people because the Rebbe had just said, here's $1 to go buy Svadim. So then it really cemented that idea that Hey Tevis, the celebration of Hey Tevis, is connected with Svadim. Okay. But now what I want to do a little bit is, after all, this is a class on Mivtza, Bais Malei Sefarim, on the Mitzvah Campaign. So I want to go back in history about 10 years before Hey Tevis. In fact, more than 10 years, 13 years before Hey Tevis, 1974. That is when the Mivtza of Bais Malei Sefarim was established. But actually, I have to go back even a little bit further than that. I have to go back to the Yom Kippur War, which was 1973. After the Yom Kippur War was not like the Six-Day War. Let's put it that way. There were many casualties, and it was, to a certain extent, even though it was a victory, it was somewhat demoralizing. So there was a big discussion among the IDF leaders how to boost morale. And the Rebbe spoke about this at the Yud-Tes Kislev Farbrengen that year, after the Yom Kippur War, that the leaders of the IDF were, the Rebbe mentioned, whenever you have Jews, so there's always an argument, right? So they were all arguing what's the best way to boost the morale of the soldiers. So different people said different things, entertainment, different things. And the Rebbe said, that's all well and good, but that's not what has stood the test of time. What is tried and true among Jews, what has always boosted our morale, even at the lowest times, and given us, a certain confidence and hope to go on. It hasn't been distraction. It hasn't been, a frivolity. It's been Torah and mitzvahs. So the Rebbe said that really, if they want to boost morale of the troops, they should give them religious objects. And the Rebbe spoke about giving them prayer books and tzitzis and a pushka to give tzedakah. Later on that year, around Shavuos time, the Rebbe then expanded that idea and said, everyone, all Jews, are members of Tzivas Hashem. By the way, interestingly enough, this is before the Rebbe started the youth group or youth organization called Tzivas Hashem. But the Rebbe said all Jews are part of Tzivas Hashem, which literally means the army of God. So what's good for the IDF is really good for Klal Yisrael. It's good for all Jewry. So then at that Farbrengen, the Rebbe said that there are certain campaigns we're going to do to boost the morale of the Jewish people. And that's when the Rebbe sort of enshrined the Mitzvah Campaigns as Mitzvah Campaigns. Now, if anyone remembers, we had a class on Tefillin. The Mivtza Tefillin started in conjunction with the Six-Day War in 1967. So that had been around already for a while. But now, in 1974, the Rebbe sort of cemented it that there's a banner called the Mitzvah Campaigns, and so they had Mivtza Tefillin, which had already been around since 67, plus the Rebbe added Mivtza Torah, the mitzvah of studying Torah, Mivtza Tzedakah, the campaign for giving tzedakah. That was last class, we did tzedakah, right? And Mivtza Bais Malei Sefarim. And in fact, the Rebbe connected the Mivtza Bais Malei Sefarim with Mivtza Torah, almost like as sort of like they go together as one thing. And very often in later years, as the Rebbe referred to Bais Malei Sefarim, the Rebbe would refer to it in conjunction with Mivtza Torah. So that's when the Mivtzaim, the 10, well, there weren't yet 10, but when the Mitzvah Campaign sort of became established. And then later on, the next year, 1975, and the year after that, 1976, the other Mivtzaim were added until finally there were a total of 10. So that's the origin of Mivtza Bais Malei Sefarim. Okay, now I want to go back even further, just like we started with Hey Tevis, which was in the 80s, and then we went back to the 70s where the Mivtza Bais Malei Sefarim was established. I want to go back even further now to the 50s. And 1951 is when Kahos, we mentioned before Kahos is the publishing arm of Lubavitch, when Kahos was founded. It was founded by the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Rebbe who came over 1941, escaping war-torn Europe, was put in charge of Kahos. So the Rebbe was the sort of the manager or the overseer of Kahos operations. So even before the Rebbe was Rebbe, the Rebbe was very involved in publishing. And not just in the scholarly side of it, and preparing the books for publication, which of course the Rebbe was involved in that part of it as well, but also the business side of things, and making sure that books should be affordable, and that they should be accessible, and making sure that they look nice, and that they're attractive, and they're well done, and that books are in print. The very practical side of things. In fact, I'll tell you something very interesting. During the Cold War, there was a fund. The Americans were paying for the printing of any books that they felt promoted Western values, as opposed to the Soviet Union's communist values, which they defined as a threat to Western values. So the government, the United States government, would give money to help publish any books that they felt were of a cultural value that would promote Western cultural values. So the Rebbe got federal funding from the Americans by telling them, well, look, you guys want to put out literature that opposes communism. We're public enemy number one in Soviet Russia. Who did the communists oppose more than Lubavitch? So, you go look at who the communists considered to be dangerous. That's us. So we're pretty anti-communist. We're pretty anti-revolutionary. So the Rebbe secured funding, and that's how many of the books that were printed in those days, in the early days, in the 1950s. I'm sorry, in the 1940s. I said the 50s. I'm saying the Rebbe became Rebbe in 1951. I'm talking back in the 40s, I should have said. In 1941, Kahos was, did I say that correctly? The 1941 Kahos was founded. If I said 51 before, plate this up, it was an error. Kahos was founded in 1941. The Rebbe came over to America in 1941. So this is back in the 40s. Okay. Also, going back to that same era, actually 1949, but again, still before the Rebbe became Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe spoke about how every home, at least Chabad Chassidim, should have 3 books in the home. Whether people study them or not, obviously, ideally, they would study them, but the point is that they should have, there's 3 particular books. Previous Rebbe spoke about it, the Fabrengen of Yud Beis Tammuz Tafshun Tes, that's the summer of 1949. They should have Keser Shem Tov, that's the book of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. They should have Or Torah, which is of the Maggid. The Maggid was the disciple of the Baal Shem Tov. And they should have Tanya, which is the book of the Alter Rebbe, who is the disciple of the Baal Shem Tov. So those 3 first generations of the Hasidic movement, they should have the books of those Hasidic masters. And the Frierdiker Rebbe mentioned that for reasons that are known to those who know, obviously like some type of mystical reason, the three books should not be bound with one binding. They should be bound separately, and that every home should have those three books. Okay, so that already was from 1949. From before the Nesius, before the Rebbe's leadership officially began in 1951. But then, obviously, with the Rebbe, the emphasis on books and purchasing books and printing books became a very important thing. And then, like we said, 1974 was the official launch of the campaign, Bais Malei Sefarim, to have a home full of Torah books. And when the Rebbe spoke about a home full of Torah books, the Rebbe said the word full, Bais Malei Sefarim, a home full of books. What does full mean? Full means full. It means that if there's a Jewish book in the world that your house doesn't have yet, it's still not full. So don't stop. It's not enough. Obviously, you start with the basics. You start with the fundamental texts, and that I've mentioned many times that every house should have a siddur, a prayer book, a chumash, the 5 books of Moses. Should have a Tanya, the basic book of Chabad Chassidus. A Shulchan Aruch that I would always mention. They should have halacha books of Jewish law, books that talk about practical observance. But that's just the beginning. Malei Sefarim, full of books, means that you don't stop and you just keep on bringing books into the home. The Rebbe also mentioned that full can mean quantitatively, also mean qualitatively. That, what does it mean qualitatively? That what really fills out the home, what really completes it, are the books. So therefore, a person should sort of prioritize the books as his prized possessions. And he should feel what really, what do I care about most in this home? The holy books. The holy books are what makes the home. It's a feeling. It's a feeling, an attitude that a person should have. That's what it means. The house is full of holy books. What fills in the home, what makes the home a home, is that it has Jewish books. Okay. One of the things also that Rebbe said in conjunction with this mitzvah campaign is that communities should establish public libraries. In Crown Heights, they actually started the Levi Yitzchok Library, which was named for the Rebbe's father, and that was in response to the Rebbe talking about libraries. I'm sure people are aware, and if they're not aware, they should be aware of an incredible resource we have locally in the 5 towns. Chabad of the 5 towns has also our Levi Yitzchok Library, which is named for Levi Yitzchok Wallowik, Olav Shalom. So that is an incredible resource, and that is a living embodiment of this call that the Rebbe made, that there should be public libraries. And the Rebbe actually didn't just say there should be public libraries. The Rebbe spoke about it in detail, that they should have hours where they're open every day so that people can go there. The Rebbe said the library building should be attractive so that people will want to walk in there, even people who not necessarily are interested in Jewish books, but they'll see a nice building and they'll end up walking in. The Rebbe spoke about the fact they should have all kinds of Jewish books, like to appeal to all different levels and different kinds of interests. And so that was a very important aspect of this campaign, the idea of public libraries. But in addition, there was the concept of private libraries, that really every Jewish home should have its own library, should be a library. And the Rebbe gave over the years various directives regarding each home being a library. We mentioned that the Rebbe mentioned certain core books. I don't know if we said Tehillim. I don't think we mentioned Tehillim, a book of Psalms. And the Rebbe also mentioned, as far as books of Chassidus, to have Torah Or and Likutei Torah. Those are books from the Alter Rebbe. We mentioned Tanya already, but Torah Or and Likutei Torah are also books of Chassidus from the Alter Rebbe. The Rebbe mentioned Halacha Svadim. The Rebbe said when a chosin and kala, when a bride and groom get married, when they're newlyweds, they should already start building their personal library. And the more the better. They should get started right away. You know, it's interesting, when people get married, they have like the gift registries, right? And the Bed Bath & Beyond, and you get them the Cuisinart and the blender and the, whatever. But don't forget the Svadim. And Rebbe spoke about that there's a custom when people get married. So often the bride's father will buy for the groom a shas, a set of Talmud, which are big books, and it's an expensive set and it's large. But it shouldn't just be the shas; it should be many books, and also that the groom should buy for the bride a gift. And the Rebbe mentioned that there was a custom that apparently there was a very popular, it's funny because we did this, my wife and I, when we got married, but there was an old custom. There was a popular siddur called the Siddur Korban Mincha. The Siddur Korban Mincha was a prayer book that had the regular Hebrew prayers, but then everything was translated into Yiddish. And that was popular because many women couldn't read Hebrew, but they could read Yiddish because Yiddish was the Mama Lashon, that was the vernacular, that was the language they spoke from day to day. So they could read Yiddish. So it was like a customary thing that a groom would buy for his bride, the Siddur Korban Mincha, this Siddur that has Yiddish translation of the prayers, which I did. I bought for my wife Siddur Korban Mincha, which we have somewhere. One of our, we're still in boxes. We just moved houses again. We have a real Bais Malei Sefarim right now, except the Svadim are in the boxes and the house is full of the boxes. But the Rebbe mentioned that it actually could be that today women are more educated. So if the groom will buy the bride a Siddur Korban Mincha, she might actually be insulted because the Rebbe said she's going to feel like, what are you implying, that I don't know how to daven from a regular Siddur? So instead, what should you do? You should buy, the groom should buy for the kala, the bride, practical halacha svarim, books that talk about practical day-to-day Jewish law, particularly Jewish law in the home, which the woman is chiefly responsible for maintaining the standard of halachic observance in the home. So, and Baruch Hashem, today there are so many books on these topics. So, guys, if you're a newlywed, or if you want to just act like a newlywed, you want to have a second honeymoon, go buy your wife some books about halacha. Yes, that's right. What did you think I was going to say? That's how you be a Jewish husband. Okay. Now, there's a third part of this campaign. So we spoke about public libraries. We spoke about private libraries. Now, even more specific, let's talk about children's personal libraries. That every child should have their own collection of Svadim, of holy books. Yeah. It's something that the Rebbe spoke about on many occasions, that children should have their own Svadim, their own holy books. In fact, even infants. And how do you see this, that even infants should have holy books? That when there's a Jewish custom that when a child is born, you put up the Shir HaMailos, you put up the card that has the words of Psalms on it, on the doorway. So you see that it benefits a child, even an infant who can't read yet, is benefited by being surrounded by holy words. So everything that a child sees from infancy is going to have an impression. So you go out and you buy Svadim, buy holy books, even for an infant. You don't have to wait until they can read. Just the fact that the infant is lying in his or her cradle and sees holy books, this has an effect, a lifelong effect. What else? Oh, the Rebbe mentioned that the books should expressly be the property of the child. That it shouldn't just be that, oh, in our house we have books that the children can use. No, you should get the child his or her own books. And for that reason, by the way, when you have Baruch Hashem, Kenan Hora, you have, more than one child, so that means you're going to have multiple copies of the same books, right? Because every kid has to have his or her own Chumash, his or her own Tehillim, his or her own Siddur. These are basic Jewish books. And each child should have his or her own copy of it. And not just the Chumash and Tehillim and Siddur, but, I should mention this, very interesting, the Rebbe said every child should have his or her own Haggadah. Interesting. Why Haggadah? I understand basic books, Chumash, Tehillim, Siddur. Why a Haggadah? Because the whole point of the Seder Haggadah, where we tell the story of going out of Egypt, is that it's an answer to the question of the child. The child is supposed to say, "Ma nishtanu alayla zeh," why is this night different from all other nights? And then we have the mitzvah. Once the child asks, then we have the mitzvah of explaining we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. So the whole Haggadah is about the child. It's the answer to the child's question. Therefore, every child should have their own Haggadah. And the Rebbe even mentioned a Haggadah with pictures, so that even if a child can't read, or even if they can read, but they enjoy seeing the pictures, but certainly if they can't read, so the pictures are very meaningful for them. Now, here's an important point about children getting Svadim. We all know that when you give a child a book, especially a small child, they don't necessarily know how to take care of it. And children often rip books. If you go to a house where there are children, you will invariably find books that have missing pages or half-torn pages. That's just what children do. So the Rebbe said that the parents should specifically tell the children, don't worry about ruining the Svadim, that it's okay, and that if you ruin it, Mommy and Tati will buy you a nicer and newer one. So, it's almost encouraging them to tear it up. And in fact, the Rebbe mentioned a medrash that says how Hashem feels loved when little children step on his name. It's a medrash that says that even when the Azkara, the name of Hashem, is trounced upon by children, obviously not adults who know better, but little children who end up, they drop a holy book and they end up running around on top of it or kicking it, not maliciously, but just because they're little children, that's actually something that Hashem regards as an act of affection. So it's a beautiful thing when little children are stepping on Svadim. Obviously, not that they're intentionally stepping on the Sefer in a way of disrespect, God forbid, but the fact that the point is there are so many holy books around, and the children have such free access to the books that the books invariably end up being handled the way small children handle things, and that we shouldn't worry about that. And not only is it okay, it's a beautiful thing. I think that's important for us as parents, because sometimes we get uptight. We can't even have nice things around here, right? That's like the perennial parental lament. But in this case, it's actually a great thing. And if your kids ruin your Svadim, The Rebbe says just buy nicer, newer ones. Just replace them. It's fine. It's good. It's like, okay. So that brings me to another point here, which is even more, I think, of a novel idea. And that is, okay, it's understood that children end up mishandling the Svadim. Now, obviously, adults shouldn't mishandle Svadim, but the Rebbe spoke about how it's a good thing when adults use their Svadim so, let's call it, excitedly, that they're not very gentle with the Svadim. Okay? Like someone who's very gentle, very careful. Come on. If you really appreciate these books, use them up. Like, use them up, really. And there's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says, Hafach ba, v'hafach ba, turn it and turn it. Right? Talking about the Torah. The Torah is full. The simple. Let me tell you first the simple meaning. The simple meaning is that Torah has endless meaning, so it's like we learn the Parsha every year. Why? Because there's another layer that we didn't get to before. So, hafach ba, v'hafach ba, turn it over, and always like find a new angle on it. V'siv uveleva, and grow old and worn out with it. Like, learn Torah and learn it and turn it over and grow old and worn out with Torah. That's the simple meaning of the Mishnah and Pirkei Avos. But the Rebbe took those words and learned it homiletically, b'derech drush, and said like this: when you're learning a sefer, when you're learning a Torah book, hafach ba v'hafach ba, turn it over and turn it over, turn it and turn it. Now, why turn it and turn it? Seemingly, you only have to turn the page once, and then, you're on the next page. Turn it and turn it means you turn the page and you start reading. You're like, hold on a second. I found a contradiction. And then you turn back the page to an earlier page because you want to go check it out and because you have a question, you have a kasha, and you want to reconcile it. So, hafach ba means you're flipping pages back and forth. You're like, hold on a second, let me compare this thing with that thing, because that's how Jews learn. Jews learn very analytically, and we question everything. So, turn it and turn it is that when you're learning a book the proper way, you turn the page up, but then you turn it back because you're constantly scrutinizing everything. And then because you're flipping the pages around so much, because you're really using this sefer, the way it's meant to be used, then v'siv uveleva, the book gets old and worn out through that. V'siv uveleva now is talking about the book. So hafach ba v'hafach ba, when you're flipping the pages back and forth, siv uveleva, the book gets old and worn out, and that's a beautiful thing. And in fact, the Rebbe says, you have to understand a little bit of Hasidic, the Hasidic view on somethingness and nothingness. I guess that itself is a whole other class. But in Hasidic, in the Hasidic worldview, like the worst thing you can be is a yesh. Yesh just means an existence. It just means something that is. Yesh, it exists. Yesh, like what do you exist? Einod milvadei, nothing exists but Hashem, right? So you're supposed to have bittul. Bittul is self-abnegation, which doesn't mean, God forbid, like shattered self-esteem or self-loathing. Bittul doesn't mean thinking less of yourself. It means thinking of yourself less. It means freedom from self-consciousness, where you transcend the self and you just become so God-conscious that there's no separate me anymore. There's no separate me. There's just Einod Milvadi. There's nothing but Him. There's nothing but the One, right? So, with that background, that from the Hasidic point of view, the greatest thing is nothingness. If you can become a nothing, that's the true something, because now you're at one with the everything. So, the Rebbe says, if you're going to really use a sefer properly, until you tear it up and it falls apart and becomes nothing, the Rebbe says, the sefer is going to thank you. Thank you for making me a nothing. Thank you for allowing me to become, one with the essence, basically. And yet, at the same time, the Rebbe points out a paradox. And everything in Judaism, especially in Chassidus, is a paradox. It's always, whenever you have a question, is it this or is it this? And the answer is always yes. Right? Like the famous story about the husband and wife come to the rabbi to complain, and the husband says his whole side of the story, and the rabbi says, you're right. And then the wife says, hold on, let me say my side. She says her side. The rabbi says to her, you're right. And then the rabbi's own wife is walking by, and she sticks her head in the door, and she says, they can't both be right. And the rabbi says to her, you're right. Right. But it's not just a joke. There's a truth in that ultimately truth is bigger than one position or another position. Truth can only be grasped through paradox. And so we always find everything is always paradox. Here's the paradox. On one hand, Svadim are meant to be worn out, used up, devoured. And that's a good thing. On the other hand, now you remind me of another joke. I'm blaming it on you. I'm talking to myself. A guy calls up a shul, and the receptionist answers the phone. Hello? Yes, I'm looking for a one-armed rabbi. And the receptionist says, what? What are you looking for? The guy says, I'm looking for a one-armed rabbi. The receptionist says, I don't understand. A one-armed rabbi? He says, yeah, I'm looking for a one-armed rabbi. Do you have one? She says, I don't know why you're looking for a one-armed rabbi. The guy says, because the one I have right now, anytime I ask him a question, he answers, and then right away he says, but on the other hand, so now I'm looking for a one-armed rabbi. One's not going to say that to me, on the other hand. So on one hand, Svadim are meant to be used up and torn apart, and that's how you show that you really love them. At the same time, on the other hand, Svadim should be nice. What does it mean, nice? They should be attractive. They should be printed on nice paper, have a nice cover. Don't judge a book by its cover, but you do, but people do. And the Rebbe actually gave feedback to Kohos regarding the size of books. Because the Rebbe once pointed out that a certain book, that it's not the right size of people, what people normally have on the space between one shelf and another. Typesetting, that the inside of the book should have nice, clear letters so it's easy to read. So on one hand, books have to be really nicely done. They have to be well made. They have to be attractive. And at the same time, on the other hand, use them up, tear them up, let them fall apart, and that's the most loving thing you can do. And they're both true. That's the paradox. Okay. Let's just talk a little bit about a few reasons why Bais Malei Sefarim, why to have a house full of Torah books. One reason is practical. There's it's said in different contexts, but they say, if you hang out in a barbershop long enough, eventually you're going to get a haircut, right? So if you surround yourself with holy books, eventually you're going to pick one up. So that's the first thing is. And I said before that Mivtza Bais Malei Sefarim, the campaign of having a house full of Torah books, is connected to Mivtza Torah, the campaign of studying Torah. That if you have a house full of Torah books, eventually you're going to study them. So that's one reason. A second reason is a spiritual reason, that the Rebbe said when you own holy books, it invokes a certain schus, a certain merit that intercedes on your behalf in heaven. That's another benefit. And then a third thing, and this is very interesting. By owning Torah books, one, at least according to one opinion, or certain opinions, one fulfills the mitzvah, it's actually the 613th mitzvah, of writing a Torah scroll. Yeah. There are 613 commandments. The 613th commandment is to write your own Torah scroll. Now, we're actually going to talk about this in another class, because the Rebbe also made a campaign of buying a letter in a Torah scroll, in a communal Torah scroll. But there is an opinion, namely of the Rosh, who says that the mitzvah to write a Torah scroll doesn't mean just to have a Torah scroll. It means to own Torah books that one is able to study from. And the mitzvah is a Torah scroll because initially the only book in Judaism was the Sefer Torah, because that was Torah Shebechsav, the written law, and everything else was oral tradition, which was not allowed to be written down. Remember, for thousands of years, the oral tradition was never written down. Not until Yehuda Nasi came along and 2,000 years ago made the Mishnah, and that was the first recording of oral law. And then after the Mishnah, there was the Gemara, and then so on and so forth, until now we have who knows how many volumes, endless volumes of written oral law. So it's funny because it's the oral law, but now it's written. And it's written because if it wouldn't be written, we would, God forbid, lose it and forget it. So the Rosh says that the mitzvah is to have a Torah scroll because the mitzvah is speaking from the perspective of the Torah, of the written law, at which time, when that was given, there was only the written law. There were no other books. But now that we have Torah Sheba'al Peh, we have oral law recorded in books, so the mitzvah to write a Torah scroll is actually fulfilled by buying Jewish books. So that I've mentioned that also, that by having Jewish books in your home and owning them, you're doing that mitzvah. Okay. I think I'll just mention one more thing. Baruch Hashem, there's much more to be said about this, but I think I'll just mention one more thing. And that is something that Rebbe said, Yud Tes Kislev, Tavshin Lamed Gimel. It was still 1972. It wasn't yet 1973. It was the last couple months of 1972. And it's interesting because the Rebbe said this before. If you remember before, I said that the Bais Malei Sefarim, this campaign was launched in the summer of 74. So actually this sikha, this address, is from before this campaign was launched. Although, like I also mentioned, the Rebbe was talking about books and dealing with books and promoting books, long before the official launch of the campaign. So just share with you something that the Rebbe said, Yud Tes Kislev, Tavshin Lamed Gimel. Just a beautiful concept. At least I felt it was beautiful, and I wanted to share it with you, and that's what I'll leave you with. That there's a special connection between Bais Malei Sefarim, having a house full of Torah books, and women. Why women? Because a woman, generally speaking, is the one who is responsible for not just setting the tone in the home. We mentioned that before, that getting a woman halacha books about practical halacha in the home because she's the one who oversees it. But more than that, just very practically, generally speaking, the woman is the one who designs the house, like physically, like the decor, the furnishings, all that stuff. Yeah, I mean, guys, tell me, when's the last time you picked out drapes? Imagine what would happen if you would come home and start putting up drapes. See how well it would go over, right? Anyways, the woman is the one who designs the home. Bais Malei Sefarim, in addition to all the other things that we've been talking about, having a home full of Torah books, it also is, in a certain way, it's the decor of the home. And it creates an environment a feeling, so that people have the feeling they're in a Jewish home. And so when a woman is designing her home, that's a core element of it. In other words, I don't think it cheapens it to say, I don't think it's crass to say that having lots of books, a wall full of books, that's important interior design. And so I want to encourage everybody to beautify your home, especially the women, to beautify their homes by having lots of Svadim. I want to mention that this class is part of a series of classes that we started at the beginning of this Jewish year. And these are all dedicated in loving memory of Dina Leah Rosenzweig OB. And that when you do these mitzvahs that we speak about, you should have her in mind that we're doing them for Dina Leah. So I encourage everybody, buy books, like today, now. I mean, it's beautiful. Today you just go online and just go buy some books, holy books, Jewish books. And when you do so, please have in mind that you're doing so on behalf of Dina Leah. And the holy books should have a good effect on you and your family.